I'm Nancy Beatty, and I'm going to be giving the first half of this presentation, and then Zoe Burkholder, my co-writer, is going to take over for the second half. By way of introduction, we would like to highlight 4 things. First, our paper puts the fundamental tensions and contradictions of civic education front and center. The history of civic education is fundamentally intertwined with the history of citizenship, including the highly contested ideas, laws, and constitutional clauses that have defined who could be counted as citizens, with what kinds of rights, and in what sovereign state or nation. So this is a history of multiple exclusions as well as inclusions, in which there were no straight lines of progress. Indeed, many once settled questions in the history of citizenship are being again contested today. Second, our paper focuses broadly on the history of education for citizenship. There are no a priori definitions of civic education. For example, the idea of civic education as a course in government is a specifically 20th century invention. The central concepts and meaning of civic education have changed over time. And those concepts and meanings have been shaped and changed by historical context and by historical agency, with legacies for the present and future of civic education, both as a pedagogical project, that is, as a matter of curriculum and teaching, and also as a policy project, that is, as a matter of law, power, and politics. Third, throughout this paper, we highlight the centrality of history to civic education. Specifically, in this presentation, we emphasize history as a form of civic reasoning, contextual thinking, that offers a disciplined way of analyzing the pursuit of civic ideals in the context of real forces of circumstance, power, and politics. And finally, the paper as a whole analyzes a total of 7 different cases of historical context and change in civic education. For this presentation, we're going to talk about 4 of those cases. And for each case, we're going to highlight 4 things. You can see we're working in 4s here. Aspects of historical context that shaped civic education, the agency of historical actors in interpreting the meaning of civic education, key concepts and changes in the meaning of those concepts, and the legacies and significance of those historical cases. So now, beginning with our first case, we're looking at a case that represents a fundamental and enduring tension of civic education. Beginning in a major way in the 1820s and 30s, civic education became the leading rationale for promoting the development of state public school systems. At the same time, however, school system development also depended directly on the appropriation of Native American lands, the sale of which capitalized most early common school funds. That template was established in 1785, 1787 with the Northwest Ordinance, which dedicated portions of newly claimed federal lands for supportive education, and it was repeated many times in subsequent acts. So this settler-colonial relationship was not incidental, but essential to converting territories from indigenous to Anglo control. School lands incentivized settler family formation and institution building, while also promoting the formation of citizenry and leaders who would establish and sustain Anglo-style systems of self-government. So in this way, settler civic education and native dispossession were directly connected in the common school era. There are many stories that can be told about the effects of settler and missionary education on Indigenous learning and lifeways. The story we're telling here at this moment provides something of a counter-narrative to the postbellum federal boarding school story with which we may be most familiar. This is a story that focuses on educational institutions developed by some southeastern tribes in the antebellum era, specifically the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole, who used treaty funds and annuities to establish academies and schools under somewhat autonomous tribal control. One of the most influential and important of those institutions was Choctaw Academy, founded in 1825 in Kentucky and later moved to Choctaw Nation lands in Indian Territory. Choctaw Academy enrolled nascent leaders from 17 different nations, and students pursued what was at the time a fairly standard Western classical curriculum. But in the process, some students articulated visions of national tribal independence that they then used to challenge US law. Importantly, some Choctaw alumni also went on to take up leadership roles within tribal nations, including as promoters of developing school systems in Indian Territory in the 1840s and 50s. As developed by these leaders, school systems in Indian Territory before the Civil War provided a civic education for sovereignty within Indian nations that paralleled that of school systems developed at the same time in other states and territories of the US. This seal is from the Muscogee or Creek Nation. Considering civic education from the perspective of Indian Territory illuminates an enduring tension. On the eve of the Civil War, civic education and public schooling in the US embodied a principle of plural sovereignty. That means that in 1860, citizenship and civil rights, including access to education, were defined on a state-by-state, nation-by-nation, territory-by-territory basis. And in 1860, almost every state, nation, and territory defined access to public education and rights of citizenship in racially exclusive terms. This fundamental tension between plural sovereignty and equal citizenship was endemic to the Common School Project, and its legacy continues to challenge attempts to affect civic education policy today. Our second case for today reflects a major change in the policy and practice of civic education at the turn of the 20th century. In the 19th century, schools promoted good citizenship pedagogically through basic education in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history. In the early 20th century, by comparison, civic education became more explicitly and deliberately nationalist, as represented by the term Americanization. Immigration, labor conflict, and World War I shaped this shift in the content and aims of civic education. After 1890, US corporate agriculture and industry significantly expanded their recruitment of displaced laboring populations from around the world, including Japan, Eastern and Southern Europe, and Mexico. In response, an array of federated non-governmental organizations developed to address immigrant issues. And those organizations ranged from ethnic organizations such as the Knights of Columbus and Jewish federations to social welfare organizations such as settlement houses and YM and YWCAs, to explicitly nationalist organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, and finally to aggressively nativist organizations such as the American Protective League, the Immigration Restriction League, and the Ku Klux Klan, the last three of which actively sought to restrict the rights of immigrants and criteria for immigration and naturalization. These diverse approaches to Americanization came to a head in the 1910s, especially with US entry into World War I, when the federal government began implementing and funding Americanization policies through the Bureau of Education, the Department of Labor, and eventually the War Industries Board. Following a model of hidden government long pursued at the federal level, these policies were implemented in coordination with various state and local agencies and organizations such as departments of commerce, local school districts, local patriotic organizations, and state defense councils. Among the practices widely adopted in response were English-only instruction, daily flag salutes, and pledges of American allegiance and loyalty. But these were not the only models of civic education adopted. According to recent work by one scholar, schools in Los Angeles adopted 5 different models of Americanization from 1910 to 1940. And these included what appears to have been the origins of the idea of civic education as a course in government as part of an adult education program offered by the public schools aimed at preparing immigrants for naturalization. Note, however, that this program was explicitly directed to white immigrants. In this context, some educators acted to challenge nativist versions of civic education and Americanization. In 1924, for example, the principal and teachers of one historically diverse elementary school in Seattle chose to cast a Japanese American boy in the role of George Washington in their President's Day school play. They also actively defended their choice in the face of considerable white backlash. Of course, their casting decision was no accident. It occurred in 1924, the year that the highly restrictive Johnson-Reed Immigration Act passed under the congressional sponsorship of Washington State's own Albert Johnson, and with active lobbying on the part of local anti-Japanese agitators. Educators in Seattle deliberately responded to that context. As conceived by those educators, civic education was not merely a matter of socializing newcomers to existing norms. It was about challenging students, parents, and dominant society to re-examine nativist assumptions and practices, thereby educating the public at large. They asserted ideas of multi-ethnic American citizenship and civic equality in the face of strong anti-Asian agitation and legislation that excluded Asians from naturalized citizenship. It should be noted, however, that these lessons of resistance to nativism and affirmation of civil rights seem to have been most explicitly taught at schools with large, non-white or ethnically diverse populations. Evidence suggests little comparable programming at the vast majority of schools in the city, which were predominantly white and middle class. In other words, the notion of civic equality supposedly represented by the US model of government seems to have been least taught where it was most needed. That is, in the segregated schools of white middle-class students. This legacy of race and class segregation continues to limit the potential of civic education. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague, Zoe Burkholder, for the second half of our presentation.
All right, thank you, Nancy. You guys can hear me, right? Yes, okay, good. I'll take head nods. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where Nancy left off by considering 2 additional case studies of citizenship education in American history, and then conclude by reflecting on some of the implications of our research. Like Nancy, for each example, I'll highlight historical context, the agency of historical actors, changing concepts of civic education, and the legacies or significance of each example. To begin, let's look at what happened to citizenship education during a time of tremendous crisis. Spurred by a global war that pitted brutal fascist regimes against American ideals of democracy and fair play, civic education expanded to include a new expectation: racial and religious tolerance, an ideal that evolved through the changing contexts of the post-war and rising Cold War eras. Nazi racial doctrines and increasingly violent race riots at home threatened American unity and the Allied war effort. Reformers, including many academics, became convinced that something must be done. According to social scientists, prejudice was caused by a lack of accurate information. The cure to racial prejudice, therefore, was to teach people the science of racial egalitarianism and human diversity. Reformers determined the best way to reach large numbers of Americans for this re-education campaign would be through the public schools. Anthropologists played a key role in this effort, including famous scholars Franz Boas, Margaret Mead, and Ruth Benedict. These images come from anthropological texts designed for classroom use in the mid-1940s. They emphasize that Jewish people represent a religion, not a race, and that people of the three supposed races of mankind, Caucasian, Mongoloid, and Negroid, were all equal. This was the first time that social scientists deliberately intervened in K-12 education for political reasons, in this case, in order to reduce racial prejudice and improve intergroup relations. Thousands of teachers nationwide heeded the wartime call to teach tolerance. The image on the left shows students in New York City completing a unit on China, as well as the importance of the United Nations in 1946. On the right, an integrated group of students conducts research on race relations in their community. This activism by anthropologists and teachers transformed citizenship education by making tolerance for diversity a marker of the ideal educated citizen. These three images highlight strategies teachers use to emphasize tolerance as an ideal. In the image on the left, students are studying the science of race. The middle photo shows students painting posters for a project called What Democracy Means, which is written up there on the top of the bulletin board. And the posters illustrate themes like brotherhood, fair play, and teamwork. The third image on the bottom shows a teacher reading a book about Chinese history and culture to young elementary students. For the first time, teachers insisted that all races were created equal and that the anthropological concept of culture explained human diversity. A growing number of teachers led students in conversations that considered racial equality and social justice for African Americans, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, and other oppressed minority groups. By the end of World War II, teachers made it clear that any expression of racial prejudice was not just uncouth, it was un-American. With the adjustment to peacetime, however, the context for these lessons shifted very quickly. Within 2 years, administrators pressured teachers to scale back lessons on racial equality and social justice, a trend that escalated alongside the domestic crackdown on civil liberties and political freedoms during the Cold War. Public school teachers were especially vulnerable as state employees, and so many decided it was probably best not to talk about controversial topics like racial equality, minority civil rights, or the United Nations. By 1948, teachers faced a dilemma: how to promote tolerance without talking about the science of racial equality or the problems of racial injustice. In response, teachers developed a deliberately colorblind approach, as these images from the early 1950s illustrate. The caption for the photo on the left reads, "All they want is to shoot for the basket. Stuyvesant High School, New York was so interested in developing a good basketball team, they forgot to ask the players' race or color." On the right, the caption reads simply, "Jim's color is clean," and it's pretty clear which student is Jim in that image. This new colorblind ideal seemed to embody the scientific definition of racial egalitarianism. However, it made it much harder for teachers to talk about racial inequality or the problems of American democracy. The wartime effort to teach tolerance created enduring legacies for civic education. Teachers now emphasize that democratic citizens believed in the brotherhood of man and fair play for all, regardless of race or color. Educated citizens were expected to speak in egalitarian terms so that racial slurs were condemned as signs of ignorance. In addition, the post-war shift to emphasizing racial etiquette over social justice lingered for many years and is still visible today. Finally, wartime lessons on tolerance ushered in a colorblind ideal in educational discourse, or the harmful notion that ignoring race is an effective way to eradicate racism. I'd like to turn now to a second historical example, the Latinx struggle for the right to self-determination in education. This movement profoundly altered civic education by forcing public schools to recognize and affirm the language, culture, and identity of minority youth as equal citizens in a democracy. Key contexts for this reform include a long history of educational activism among Mexican American families in the Southwest, marked by legal victories challenging racist practices in the public schools. The success of the Black civil rights movement and the new Chicano and Puerto Rican civil rights movements inspired many Latinx educational activists in the late 1960s. Families were especially frustrated by discriminatory practices, including school segregation, tracking, hostile teachers, and English-only policies. Activists were also angry at the low levels of Latinx academic achievement that made it harder for working-class kids to achieve economic security as adults. Anglo school leaders resisted reform until finally students forced the issue. In March of 1968, Mexican-American students at Los Angeles' Lincoln High School organized the era's largest school boycott. Marking what the media called a revolution, thousands of Mexican-American students in East Los Angeles walked out of school to protest English-only language policies, discriminatory IQ testing, racist teachers, a whitewash curriculum, and the lack of Mexican-American teachers and guidance counselors. The 1968 blowouts represented a new and more radical youth-based activism. Declaring themselves part of the Chicano movement, these young activists took pride in their brown racial identity and scorned assimilation. Students demanded respectful teachers, the right to speak Spanish, the opportunity to study Mexican history, more Mexican-American teachers and administrators, bilingual education, and increased student rights. Echoing cries of Chicano power, school blowouts erupted in Denver, Chicago, and in dozens of towns and cities in Texas in the late 1960s. Puerto Rican educational activists in cities like New York, Boston, and Springfield made similar demands for educational equality. Over the next 2 decades, the right to self-determination in public schools was strengthened through a series of laws, court rulings, and vocal Native American and Latinx educational activism. English-only policies were terminated, and schools developed new strategies to help English language learners succeed. Many of these programs emphasized a bicultural approach that explicitly valued Latinx and Indigenous heritage. For example, this image shows a Navajo elder instructing students in the Navajo language and culture at the community-run Rough Rock Demonstration School in Chinle, Arizona. Although such programs drew objections by conservatives, they transformed the function and purpose of civic education. I'd like to highlight 4 key legacies of Latinx activism in the 60s and 70s that helped affirm the right to educational self-determination. Schools now recognized a range of identities as compatible with American citizenship, and many teachers now portrayed cultural diversity as a strength of American democracy. Additionally, educators started to dismantle discrimination against Latinx students, a project that is still very much in progress today. Finally, the institutionalization of bilingual and bicultural education created new tensions over the assimilating function of public schools in a democracy. I'd like to conclude this afternoon by considering a few of the key takeaway points from our study in the history of civic education in the United States. It's worth emphasizing that history plays 2 distinct but interrelated goals in this project. First, a history of civic education reveals how power dynamics in the past shaped the evolution of citizenship education over time, and especially how people of color, youth, and women worked to make civic education more inclusive and fair. Second, we argue that the discipline of history is itself an essential component of meaningful civic education, given that we want to prepare young people to think critically, develop the ability to analyze a problem contextually, and see themselves as potential agents of change. This brings us to our final question. Can we use history to improve civic education in the present? We believe the answer is yes, and I'd like to conclude by highlighting a few takeaway points from our study. We believe that improving civic education requires Americans to strengthen history education in K-12 schools. History is a category of civic reasoning that helps people navigate the complexities of democratic citizenship. This is especially imperative in the current moment when social media and false news stories have made it much more difficult for the general public to sort fact from fiction as informed citizens. Civic education must cultivate the skills of contextual analysis, reflective inquiry, and critical thinking so that Americans can evaluate competing claims, deliberate with others, engage in civil dialogue, and advocate effectively for justice, many of the ideas we heard about in the last panel. More effective civic education means stronger and better history education, an objective that will require new approaches and a stronger commitment to teacher education and professional development. Second, we believe a renaissance in civic education requires more robust popular support for the civic function of public schools. Scholars must persuade Americans that civic education is essential to democracy. Citizens who support this objective, in turn, can advocate for state laws mandating more inclusive history education. Explicit civics instruction helps students understand the constitutional framework of American governance, and as such, it is essential. But we argue that instruction in national and global struggles for human rights are equally vital. Today, only 12 states require public schools to teach about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and only 4 require instruction in LGBTQ history. Without these laws, most teachers will skip what they see as difficult or controversial subjects. However, when states mandate instruction in subjects like African American Holocaust and LGBTQ history, then teachers have more authority to teach these crucial subjects, even over the objections of parents or other administrators. Finally, 21st century civic education must offer integrated pedagogy curricula in schools with the explicit objective of advancing social justice. This means we must transform existing practices by welcoming the voices and critiques of scholars of color. We know that Native American, African Americans, and Latinxes are portrayed inaccurately in K-12 curricula, and that much of our pedagogy fails to meet the needs of all students. Scholars like Bettina Love argue that we need radical new educational approaches to address continued racial inequalities, or what she calls abolitionist teaching. Love writes, quote, "Abolitionist teaching is the practice of working in solidarity with communities of color while drawing on the imagination, creativity, refusal, remembering, visionary thinking, healing, rebellious spirit, boldness, determination, and subversiveness of abolitionists to eradicate injustice inside and outside of schools," end quote. This kind of visionary education must be delivered in more integrated schools. The astronomical rates of racial segregation and inequality in our public schools are inherently anti-democratic and unsustainable. They cement inequality into place and provide a terrifying object lesson in state-sponsored institutionalized racism. This must change, as segregated and unequal public schools cannot function as sites of effective citizenship education in a modern democracy. American public schools have always been dedicated to civic education, but they've never successfully prepared all students for equal citizenship. And historical analysis provides some suggestions on how to critically interpret the shortcomings of civic education in the past so that we can reimagine a new kind of civic education for the future. Thank you. That's it for me.
Anyone else from your panel that will present, or should we go to the discussant?
We can go to the discussant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Groger. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you to the panelists, to our chair, and for the invitation to participate in this workshop, in this panel. The authors wrote a really paper that's longer than what you just heard now. And it's an incredibly impressive paper because it tries to tell the complete history of education for citizenship in one article, and also make recommendations then for how this history can inform contemporary practice. So I just want to say kind of to start that it is a very impressive feat, kind of what you managed to do in this paper, and I think a really valuable one. I'll try not to repeat too much of what was already said in the presentation, but just again, the goal of thinking about history in this paper, as stated by the authors, is that, quote, "We look at history in order to understand better how civic education has been shaped by power dynamics that have excluded certain people and ideas." This theme of exclusion and power is a really central one throughout the paper. And history plays two key roles in the project, as stated by the authors. One is how power dynamics shaped the evolution of citizenship education over time, and also how of color work to make civic education more fair. I wanted to, I'm going to kind of structure my remarks by moving through sort of each time period and posing a question that struck me while reading about each time period. And then also I have a couple questions about the recommendations and implications that the paper provoked for me. And I'm looking forward to kind of a rich discussion with what this paper provoked. So one important kind of starting note too that the authors mentioned is that it's really important from the get-go to make this historical point that the idea of civic education is historical, has never meant one thing. It itself needs to be historically contextualized in order to make sense. And they noted that what we might sort of typically think of as a civics class or civic education as a kind of government course in the curriculum, that's a fairly new concept and idea of the 20th century. And in prior centuries, there's a much broader, we can think about education for citizenship in a much broader way as what kind of education did a citizen need? And that was answered in different ways. And I think the different time periods, as I noticed sort of how the authors are examining the different time periods, it seemed like different aspects of the school system kind of come to the fore. There are certain eras where their focus is on the curriculum. Others are kind of looking at who had access to schools in the first place and how this reflected disparities about ideas for citizenship. And also looking at disparate school funding, practices, legislation. So all of these kind of facets of it, what I'm calling facets of education, shaped what education for citizenship was in these different periods. All right, so a couple kind of notes, some points that the authors made that that really struck me that are in the discussion of the 18th century and early 19th century is that the authors state the very convergence of interests that made the Republican experiment of the United States possible assumed the categorical denial of citizenship by race. So this was a time period when education for citizenship was understood to be the education for boys and predominantly white boys. The authors make the point too that women were not fully considered citizens. They didn't have voting rights, and neither did African Americans, enslaved African Americans. So I think this is a really important point, that the very category of what it meant to be a citizen was premised on the exclusion of other groups. And this in turn meant that who had access to education that would fit one to be a citizen was only appropriate and accessible to some. The authors also inform us that the early common schools in the 19th century were literally premised on the appropriation of native land. The ways that funding worked, federal government would dedicate portions of new federal lands for the support of education. And they also have a very striking line in the paper that, quote, native dispossession and citizenship education were directly connected. So I think I wanted to highlight these very striking passages. And to me, they indicate the ways that not only the curriculum, the focus in this period isn't so much on the curriculum, I would say, although they do talk about it, but kind of the entire system of education was premised on a certain understanding of citizenship that was exclusionary. And I want to note too that the authors in each time period point out kind of tensions and ways that, you know, indigenous schools had their own model of civic education. But for the kind of dominant schools of the common school movement, this sort of entire structure was premised on exclusion. So even before we get to talking about curriculum, we sort of need to think about who's in school and who is not in school. And just the fact of receiving a basic education and literacy was already a very limited good to which only certain groups had access. So my question kind of for this these early periods is I was curious about how the authors would think about social class in sort of the concept of education for citizenship. So education in this time period was limited to predominantly middle or upper class students. It was not kind of universal yet. So how is class also bound up with our understanding of who is a citizen and who is worthy of receiving an and I think this question kind of occurred to me first when I was reading the early time period. I'm curious about how you think about it in later periods. If kind of part of what notions of an ideal citizen are in different time periods, the kind of appropriate behaviors and manners of what a citizen does, is that kind of shaped by middle norms, values, and kind of bringing it all the way to the present in our student crisis of student debt, families not being able to pay for college. How does class shape our thinking about who has access to citizenship education, or what education for citizenship look like under those circumstances? I think the paper focuses predominantly on race, ethnicity, and gender, and does so very richly. But so I wanted to ask a question about class, how class comes in. Once we get to the progressive era, kind of through the Cold War, I think the focus of the authors turns more explicitly to the curriculum. We see that in the Americanization movement, when civic education becomes more nationalist, an emphasis on racial equality in the World War II era, and then the what they call the shifting political wind, Cold War era, to kind of focus on conformity, friendliness, and good manners. And I wondered here, question that this provoked for me was what the authors would say in this era, this kind of mid-20th century period, about kind of the structure of the school system as a whole. So in a kind of broader than the curriculum, thinking about who is included and excluded, and how that, again, kind of lens that was very prominent earlier period might be applied here. So this was, of course, the period of the high school movement, when high school became common even for low-income students and for immigrants. So in this sense, more students have access to education. At the same time, this is the period of Jim Crow, school segregation, and even if African Americans had more access than they had previously to schools, these schools received less funding. The school day and school year tended to be shorter, and resources were scarce. So I wondered kind of how you might apply the same lens of systemic lens of looking at the school system as a whole that you adopt in the earlier periods and apply it to the mid-20th century, and how this also forced an exclusive understanding of citizenship. Okay, the last kind of historical segment on the 1950s and 60s, the authors discuss school integration as being foundational, dating back to the arguments made in the lead up to the Civil War, but kind of the idea that school integration is a requirement for the possibility of education for citizenship. And they discussed civil rights activism that shaped both the curriculum as well as school practices. And I really liked the focus on the Latinx struggles for self-determination. I think the sort of lesser told struggles of Mexican Americans and Puerto Rican students who fought back against English-only laws, and alongside Native Americans also pushed for bilingual programs. So I just want to say, I love I really appreciated that discussion of the 1960s. I'll turn now briefly to the recommendations. And I think kind of a big question for this section is really, I mean, I guess this is the perpetual question, right? To what extent can education solve problems that are rooted in much larger political and economic dynamics of power imbalances? So what can education alone do to reshape politics? And I think we see evidence in the many historical examples that the authors provide for ways that the curriculum for different school practices can push back against power dynamics, but we also see how schools from the very beginning and how understandings of citizenship education have also reflected power imbalances and reproduced these structures. Kind of how should we, to what extent can we rely or can we push on education to do this work for us? I noted a kind of interesting, I wanted to ask about in the beginning of the recommendations section, note that, you know, civic education is important at this particular historical moment because, quote, of the disturbing lack of civility in contemporary American political discourse and the corresponding increase in racial, ethnic, and religious intolerance among youth. And I wondered how the authors, I wanted to ask about the kind of meaning and their understanding of this lack of civility, because it reminded me a little bit, and I think in discussions about civility in contemporary classrooms now in an age of student protest and student activism, it reminded me a little bit of the kind of critique of the Cold War civic education, the kind of colorblind racial etiquette, or a focus on good manners, right, but not the kind of potential protest needed to address larger structural inequalities. So I'm curious sort of how we can push between these two approaches, the kind of the Cold War era, like, are we just sort of trying to keep everybody, make sure we have good manners, but then not address the kind of larger, deeper inequalities, or is there something else that the in this recommendation section at the end? I also wanted to ask, what does citizenship education look like or mean for non-citizens in our school systems, for undocumented students in our school systems? Is the word citizenship problematic? Should we think, or should we now talk about global citizenship, or should we kind of, is that term itself outdated? Should we be thinking, does it fit into kind of new, what the authors call emancipatory pedagogies that they kind of point to as future directions? Does the word citizenship always kind of point to one normative understanding of citizenship that actually we might not want to be promoting? And then I will conclude with, the authors, one of the recommendations is this idea of emancipatory curricula and pedagogy. I think that fits in with this idea of abolitionist teaching. And here I think I just wanted sort of more details of what that might look like. And also, I guess it had me thinking about whether we would recognize certain kinds of practices that push back against the status quo as civic education. And I guess I'm thinking about things like civil disobedience, about student walkouts, over gun violence. Is youth activism part of civic education? Should we be encouraging students to participate in protests rather than attending class? Or should we, in class are skills like learning how to run for political office or learning how to organize a union. I mean, all these sort of practices that potentially would fight for the kinds of social justice goals that we, you know, that we want to see in a democratic society. Does that really, does that goal then really blow open what we might consider the bounds of citizenship education? So what would that look like? I will stop there, but just want to say again, a really thought-provoking paper. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. I hope it's okay if I jump in. Thank you, Tina. Those were fantastic comments. I thought what I might do is pick up on a few of those and then take on the sort of early period questions you asked and then turn it over to Zoe to take it up from there. So just quickly, I would, just kind of confirm the direction of several of your comments. Yes, civil disobedience is civic education. I think that the paper is really showing that those histories of alternative understandings and interpretations of civic education have been important in shaping the meaning of civic education. And I think one way to sort of address your question about how can education address these large, big social issues, to what extent can it? I think one answer to that is to think about the cultivation of historical agency in students of today as a way to do that. And I think the historical examples we looked at would suggest that there are precedents in the past for that kind of connection between both a curriculum on the one hand and organizing power from outside of the school and organizing traditions from outside of the school. The linking of those two things have been important in the past. And I think that, again, for the case of the value of teaching history to civic education, that learning about those precedents and examples could be important ways of cultivating the agency of students that then could address the larger social issues. So that would be kind of my route to answering some of those comments that you made. I think now to link back to some of the questions you raised about the earlier periods of civic education, the social class question, et cetera, in a way that also addresses one of your questions about the present, I think, is one thing that really came out to me in putting together our analysis for the early periods is that actually a lot of people were being educated, a lot of women were being educated, African Americans to some extent in certain situations actually were being educated. But when the civic education focus, the education for citizenship focus came out as a matter of policy, the vision of who would be included was narrowed. So as a matter of everyday practice, yes, there were a broad number of students by class, by race, by gender, who were receiving some kind of education. But when the focus was on, okay, now we're going to make this a public project to have education for citizenship, then the vision of who was included was narrowed. And by race and other ways as well. So, and gender and, et cetera. So I think the implications of that actually tie to what you were asking about, when we talk about education for citizenship now, are there people we're excluding, like undocumented students? Yes, I think that is kind of one of the implications, and you can kind of see that. So when we talk about civic education now, when we talk about education for citizenship now, are we thinking about homeless students or undocumented students as part of our polity that we're trying to include in our civic education project? or not. I think this perhaps a similar narrowing occurs in the present when we think about that project. At the same time, I think there are historical precedents. So for example, from the progressive era, the different models of kind of civic education that were adopted kind of simultaneously in different contexts included ideas of world citizenship and sort of transnational citizenship that were not as nationalist and were in some ways trying to resist that nationalism and nativism. So I think there are historical precedents for that too, and we could be, you know, explicit about engaging the ways in which different framings of citizenship and civic education are either limiting or expansive, and talk about the different precedents in relation to those ideas. But I'm really a 19th century person, as you know, and Zoe's more of a 20th century person. So now I will turn it over to Zoe.
Thanks, Nancy. Thank you, Tina, for those great questions. I wrote down at least 7 that you asked, and so I'm not going to try to address all of those. I thought I would just pick up with one of the ones you asked at the end, talking about this current moment of crisis. And I wanted to talk about that one because I think you're right. The danger is that we might you know, somehow encourage teachers to convey the message that what we're looking for is good manners from students, or to not talk about race or not talk about racial inequality in some way. And I think that that is very clear that we do not want to do that, but it's tricky, right? Like, how do you get teachers to actually engage with these issues? The reason we pointed to that problem is because of a rise in what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls bias incidents in public schools. And even in my town, which is Montclair, New Jersey, which is super progressive, like we're like the People's Republic of Montclair, you know, we're like this a very racially integrated community. We have a solid proportion of Jewish students, all sorts of students. It's pretty progressive and pretty integrated. And we have just had the 3rd incident this year of students carving swastikas on desks and graffiti on the walls. And that's in addition to a number of other bias incidents, including a basketball game recently where our school played a mostly white independent school and we won, and their students started chanting. And I mean, these are like really wealthy, really well-educated kids from, you know, the best families in town if you're looking at socioeconomic class, and these kids were chanting racial slurs in a stadium, in a high school game, in town, in our super progressive community. This is something that's happening nationwide, and in many cases this is accompanied by acts of violence. So there's a real problem. And that sense of urgency comes from that, I think. It's obviously mirrored by, or maybe even echoing, national political discourse and other themes that are taking place. But I think it does put new significance on this question of civic education and how do we prepare all of our young people to be like decent human beings, you know, who have things like empathy and who can care and who can see things from other people's perspective. And it is a challenging project. A lot of the work that teachers do is dedicated towards trying to cultivate those ideals. I run workshops here at Montclair State on Holocaust education, for example, and that's really one of the explicit lessons we try to get teachers to convey to their students, is kind of the power of taking action, the ability to be an agent of change. You know, how to be an upstander is how we tell teachers to talk about it, right? But those things come from studying history, and I think there's a lot of space to improve our education in those ways, to specifically help teachers teach about how to look at history critically, how to focus on social justice, and how to prepare students to have empathy, see things from other people's perspective, and to begin to think carefully about their words and their actions. Things that might seem, you know, not a big deal, or that's just funny, or everybody's doing it, you know, have real significance. I would love to address your other 6 questions, and I could go on all day, but I would also love to hear from the other folks who are here. So if it's okay with everyone, I thought we could open it up for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you for that great historical grounding and also for your insightful comments, Christina. Again, I just want to go over some of the operations for this question and answer period. For folks in the room, if you could flip your name tag, and that'll help us identify who would like to speak. And then if you're online, if you can click the raise hand feature and then also send a note to the moderator or the co-host. I know that Sarah couldn't find the raise hand feature. I found it if you click the participants icon on the bottom of the page, that'll pop up a window, and it's actually at the bottom of that window. So I can get us started in the room, and I'm having trouble reading that far from iCivic. Emma from iCivics, if you want to go next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for an interesting paper and an interesting presentation. First, it was really refreshing to hear a focus on the purpose and substance of civic education rather than just the degree to which it's been prioritized and taught, or not prioritized and not taught, at least not nearly enough. And I want to say that I smiled when you presented the civics approach of 1939 to 1954, and I sort of foolishly thought, oh, cool, okay, so we had 15 good years, right? 15 years where we were teaching it, actually teaching it, and teaching it in a better way, if you will. But then, of course, you reminded us of the colorblind approach it was promulgating, and yeah, there were really no glory years to civic education. So, so at different times throughout American history, schools have treated civic education either narrowly through specific courses such as social studies, American government, civics, American history, or more broadly as the fundamental purpose of schooling itself. I think that's what you meant when you said there's no a priori definition of civic education. It seems to me that today we're trying to do both. We're trying to push for a restoration of the civic mission of schools, sort of cultivate a national mindset shift that embraces civic education as the purpose of schooling. But we're also pushing for more civics courses, which designates, of course, civics as a discipline. So we're pushing for more civics courses. We're pushing for better standards, better pedagogies as well. And so my question is this: can we have it both ways? Or are we undercutting education for citizenship as the primary purpose of schools if we're pushing for more civics coursework, stronger standards, et cetera?
Yeah, I guess I'll take one stab at it. There's kind of an echo there. I don't know.
That's me.
One stab I'd take at that is from maybe the progressive era example, and say something like, there have always been multiple models of civic education simultaneously being enacted. And so I guess, and I think that in a way gives us kind of the richness of different precedents to look at to address different issues and different contexts. So I guess, at least based on history, I wouldn't necessarily be nervous about there being multiple models being promoted at the same time. And in fact, you know, there's no way to predict what we'll need in the future. Having multiple models then gives you more alternatives as different contexts demand different responses. So although I do understand that there's a kind of political project question behind your comment, that you know, if we're trying to think about what do we concentrate on now as a project for civic education, you know, I think the idea, if we're talking about kind of law or mandates, I think the kind of state-by-state process of getting the strongest civic education support and mandate we can in each state, which is going to be very different in each state in terms of how much can be accomplished, is, you know, probably should be a top priority. But that's my take. I don't know. I'll let Zoe speak if she has something to say.
Sorry, I turned my mic off and then couldn't get it back on. Yeah, I would agree with everything that Nancy just said. We always do have multiple forms of civic education going on, and that is to be expected, and that in some cases it's fine and it's appropriate as people adjust the form of education to the needs of their school and community. I also wanted to just kind of reiterate the fact that there's kind of this explicit civic education where we have time set aside in the curriculum where certain teachers are instructing students about how American government and politics works, and then we have these more implicit forms of teaching who is a valid citizen and what kinds of rights people have in our community. And Christina, a point you brought up earlier about looking at social class is a really great one, and one that deserves more attention in our paper. But this question of, you know, to what extent are we inclusive of students from working class and even impoverished backgrounds, and how does our citizenship education both explicitly and implicitly include them in a fair way? We also have a number of other panelists who are with us here this afternoon, so if anyone else wants to jump in, that would be great.
We also have a lot of questions lined up, and the order, Megan Bang and Jane Lowe are the two next up. We have two in the room, and then we actually have a couple more from online. So
Go for it. The more we hear, the more we hear.
Okay. So Megan Bang, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks all. Hi, Nancy. It's nice to see you too.
Hi, Megan.
I had a couple of questions, and I'll send a longer email. But one thing that I wanted to ask about, so first I'll just say I really appreciate having Native people represented in this piece. And at the same time, I wanted to offer some thoughts about some of the formation that I see here that I think is really important, that I think might be under-articulated here a little bit. And the first is that I worry a little bit. So it's nice to see this case in here, and the semi-autonomous schools is an interesting construction of what was happening at the time for Native people. And those schools were predicated on Indigenous cultural erasure. And I'm just not sure I see that in the text at all. I know that it was a Western form, but those schools actually worked on eliminating Indigenous languages and reproducing a kind of sovereignty, Native sovereignty, but Native sovereignty on US nation state terms. And so I think given both, I want to applaud the representation, but I also want us to be careful about how we're replicating or could be replicating a kind of view of choice that I'm not sure is historically accurate about what was happening here. The second thing that I wanted to ask a question about that I was a little bit confused by, and you all may know the history better. So the attendance and the constraining of citizenships on Native people if they chose to be white was actually a deliberate act to engage in further Indigenous erasure. And we didn't actually have citizenship until 1924, and we didn't actually have voting rights until 1947. And so I wonder about this case and the recognition of the adoption of the school in this paradigm, but still the racial exclusion that was being played out in these paradigms. And so I just wonder if it would add an interesting nuance. And I worry a little bit this message is as if Native people were considered citizens or able to participate in citizenship far earlier than we actually were. So my question is if you thought about that contradiction that was happening in this particular case?
Yeah, I appreciate the questions you're raising. I would make a few distinctions that I think, you know, obviously in the longer paper, we go into some of the complexities of this in a greater degree than in the presentation. First, I would make a distinction between choice and agency in some ways in this context. In other words, I feel like what we're trying to highlight is the agency of some Native leaders and students in a very constrained context. And in a way that issue is throughout a number of the examples. You know, that's kind of where history lives, is yes, their real circumstances always contradict the ideal. And so in a way, a lot of the focus of the examples and of historical thinking, I think, is trying to find the space of agency within those constrained contexts. And that's the intent and the spirit behind drawing on those examples. I guess the other thing I would say about the specific question about citizenship that maybe didn't come across in the presentation, and I'll think about how to do it better in the paper, but we are not implying that there was a US citizenship access in this time period for Indigenous peoples. What this, this relatively recent scholarship on this antebellum period is highlighting, I think, and what we're trying to highlight from that scholarship is that there was an alternative understanding of citizenship within, it's more of an analogy, but that this is representing a kind of idea of citizenship within native sovereignty. So it's not a US citizenship, it's a different polity, a different sovereignty. I guess, and maybe depending on what the audience is, this may be in a way too complex, but I think one of the realizations I came to in that analysis is, how actually in some ways that idea of plural sovereignty was normative to that period in the US context as well. I mean, the degree to which states and other territories also had their own powers to define who was citizens was quite extensive. Unfortunately, a lot of the ways in which that was enacted was to be racially exclusionary. But
I guess my point is that historically that's not true for tribes. So tribes are engaging in that formation in the context of a settler colonial takeover. And I'm with you. I read the piece actually.
Okay,
partly why I'm saying I think I understand where you were going with this. And I'm really excited about it being present and more nuanced, as most civics education doesn't do it. But I'm not. But it's a strange thing to think about agency in the construction of power. And part of the reason I'm naming this is because I actually think what are agentic moves in civics reasoning, given historicized power and constructs, that I wonder if it's important for us to know. And it's not just in your piece, quite frankly. I think this came up in the previous panel of people's construction of what's possible to do is saturated by history and current context.
Sure. Yeah.
And it seems important to name that, not only for accuracy in history, to be honest, but also for us to understand, like, what does it mean to cultivate civic agency in the now too? Because I think that one of the key problems we're facing is that people don't feel civic agency, right? And so it seems like how we articulate civic agency in the face of nuanced power formations actually could be really beneficial for young people to understand that. So that's partly where I'm coming from about this, because I see it, but it felt a little bit, in the piece, it felt like there were some power dynamics that weren't quite articulated that make some of these formations much more sense, and without them, they could read more super problematic.
Okay, so we definitely share that project of promoting a contextualized understanding of agency.
Okay, great. And we actually are really backed up with a lot of speakers, so I just wanted to make a pitch to have everyone to be brief, but also seeing this as a start of a conversation that people can also follow up with more detail over email to the authors. I also wanted to make a comment that we are going to save the information on the group chats. There are some other good comments being made. In particular, Ted McConnell shared information about the Civics Now Coalition, and then also someone else shared information on the MICFA Challenge organization that's also doing work, and it reminds us that whether it's in the history paper or somewhere else, we also need to describe some of these more modern movements and modern work that's happening, and we take that to note, and we'll make sure that it's covered somewhere in this project. So the next person I have is Jane Lowe.
All right, thank you so much for the panel. And so first, I'm trying to tie this back to the philosophical foundations paper, and so this might not be a question for Nancy and Zoe to answer specifically, but I'm curious to hear from the philosophers as well. But through their paper, the historic paper, I sort of kind of read two things to piggyback off of what Megan was talking about. There's sort of this theme of inclusion, right, that the paper is trying to argue for over time, and exclusion that happens through citizenship education or civic education. But I'm also curious, you know, to what degree is it that it's not really about who has access to it, but the it itself needs to change, right? So at one point in time, it's a question about those people who were excluded from having access to this thing. Now to the question of, you know, figuring out what the thing ought to be anyway. So based on Zoe's sort of anecdote about what's happening today, it seems like even the white privileged kids aren't really getting the kind of civic education they should be getting. So maybe it's not just about access, but the it itself, hence the philosophical question should be debated. And I don't know if this body needs to think about what that means, or if, you know, that's something that we want to tackle and nailing down what that looks like.
That's great. I'll just make one quick comment in response to that, which points back to the example from the 1920s, where there was a certain powerful version, not just of inclusion, but of addressing nativist issues in that context, but it was occurring more in the schools that were diverse than it was in the privileged schools. So I think there's still an access issue in there, but it's a reverse of how we often think about access issues. It is whether powerful versions of agentful history of civic education and civic education are being taught to dominant students as well. And yeah, so that's just it's partly the it. I get what you're asking, and that definitely matters. And there are definitely, you know, examples out there that can help us think about that. But it's still also an access issue in terms of who is included, who is getting what kind of civic education, I guess.
Okay.
Can I
Great. Next we have Dave. Another panelist want to respond to that? Okay.
I was just going to say really quickly, if that's okay, that Jane, I appreciate the question very much. And I think it reiterates the importance of context when we look at how and why civic education changes over time. Certainly contemporary political events can be very powerful. And when we look at the brief story I told about students at Montclair High School writing swastikas on the desk, which again is something we're seeing at schools nationwide, it's not just Montclair, that these are acts of violence. They're forms of intimidation. And if we need to compel students not to do that by telling them it's bad manners, then by all means, I think we should compel them not to do that. Like at some point, and that's what happened during World War II, right? I mean, I didn't go into those examples in this presentation, but the reason teachers were so eager to teach racial tolerance is because the things that their students were saying and doing in the classrooms were horrific and much along those lines. And it was leading to like fist fights and other kinds of violence in the school. And teachers really felt, I mean, it wasn't just that they wanted to like make citizenship more inclusive. They also wanted to like deter violence and intimidation against minority students in their school because they saw it as disruptive, as dangerous, as a threat to national security. And we have some of those issues today as well. So I'm going to stop talking so we can go to the next question. Thank you.
All right, great. And we have, you know, at most 10 minutes, and we have 6 people that are lined up to talk. So kind of use that as a guide. Dave Campbell is next.
I promise I will be brief. In fact, mine is not even really a question. It's more of a comment or a suggestion. As we think about next steps, what will come out of this project, I'd like to draw a connection between the truly fascinating case studies that were highlighted in this paper and an earlier meeting that I was at a few months ago, pre-coronavirus, if you can remember that world, when people still actually attended meetings. It was also held in Washington, and Peter Levine, who was, of course, part of our previous panel, was the organizer of it. And what he was doing is putting people who are interested in civic education together to come up with case studies to be used either in schools of education or, you know, in other, he was thinking college-level classrooms to think about civic education and how it operates on the ground. And so he was looking for contemporary examples. It occurred to me that the case studies highlighted in this paper would be an excellent example of case studies from the past that could be used in either or both of the following ways. One, as with Peter's project, for college-level instruction of those who will become civic educators. But also, I could imagine these stories being used, these case studies, for actual civic education in the schools as an opportunity to discuss what civic education really means by looking at these cases from the past, which I have found as an educator sometimes opens up ways to discuss contemporary issues because you're just framing them as something that happened in the past, so it seems a little safer to do that. And I'll just close by saying that if we took that suggestion and ran with it, it would really be an example of the headline on this slide of using history to improve civic education. I think it would be an opportunity to truly use history in the classroom itself in order to improve the way we teach about civics. So just food for thought.
That's my response.
I say that's brilliant. Thank you. We agree.
All right, Carol Lee.
Okay. So again, I enjoyed the the presentation. First, I would say to the entire group that the conception of this whole project, at least in my mind, since I'm the one who put the idea out to the academy, was not one about how to improve civics teaching solely, but rather the question, the kind of question, I guess, that Jane had raised, of how can, in this case, public schooling prepare young people to engage in civic agency, civic reasoning, civic debate, which was not been mentioned so far, but that was part of it. We had debates over that, and discourse. So think broadly about the spaces and range of kinds of supports for this work. And we had debates in the project over this question of civility. And I'm just, in terms of speaking personally, while that's a problem, I don't think that's the issue. There are instances where people don't need to be civil to one another because the nature of the questions on the table are so consequential that this notion that somehow if we're nice to each other in terms of how we talk to each other gets at the heart of the issue. For me, one of the overarching takeaways from these examples, and it goes back to that slide I had originally about these conundrums, this challenge of the question of who gets to be human and the nature of human rights is a fundamental dilemma. And it was much, and I was curious, Nancy and Zoe, when you were talking about this case of the 1939, was it the 54, and I kept wondering, what is the slice of schools? I'm not a historian, but I am old. Not quite as old as Judith, but I'm next in line on that scale. Is that whatever that you guys talked about have been in a sliver of schools. Those pictures where there's a little black kid in the middle, that was not the dominant mode of education, public education from 1939 to 1954. Now, maybe Jim Anderson, I don't know if he's here or not. Excuse me. But these examples, and I think this is an issue that Megan was raising, that of these cases are occurring where there's sort of multiple sort of strands of kind of ideology around the nature of schooling. And it's important, and part of the history examples is understand these things are happening in tandem and in tension often with one another. There's also the issue of local control, considering that schools are essentially run locally by states, that the fundamental agency for what happens in schooling is going to happen at the state level, and within the politics of the state, the relationship between districts and states. That's where the action is going to occur, because the federal government only has primarily either money or actions of states or districts that go against constitutional issues where the feds have access, which means that in all the instantiations of the goals we're talking about, there's going to be great variation. And the good thing about that variation is I've also been very clear from the beginning that the work that we're trying to do in this panel, if it comes off as we're trying to prepare kids to become politically left agents or politically right agents, we're going to cut off access. At the end of the game, this is one of the things I was trying to raise about, to me, the nature of the government in the United States, is that it has to be a big enough bubble where all these different positions can somehow figure out how to live with one another so we don't end up with another civil war. And so I think it's important that there's going to be wide variation in terms of how any of this is taken up. But the question then becomes, what is it across the K-12 spectrum and the array of kinds of experiences that kids have that are going to prepare them to engage with this complexity in such a way that they can find ways to sort of safely pursue what their own kind of goals and dispositions are, understanding what are the resources available to them in terms of the structure of the government to be to have agency. And these examples of the agency, I think, are going to be very important. And then just my final comment, so I have issues with the civility question. I have issues with the, citizenship education for citizenship. To me, it's education for a sense of agency, and how can I be an active participant in decision-making that affects my life and the life of others. And then I think my final comment, I'm going long, but strong feelings on this, is I think that, Megan, that there are some parallels around this question of plurality of citizenship. For example, in terms of indigenous peoples, especially indigenous peoples who associate with who see themselves as members of tribal nations that are themselves, at least in theory, sovereign, and some of the issues around populations that we have now, undocumented persons who have citizenship in the nation from which they came and are potentially seeking citizenship here. But it's been an essential part of this nation's history because we're so young and we are a nation fully of immigrants other than indigenous populations who were here, is that there's this this dual sense of participation of who I am. I'm an American and I'm Italian. I'm an American and I'm German, and the ways in which that all sort of plays out. So that's it.
I think I'm just going to take that in and hear more questions. So I think now I'll just take notes and hear from as many people as we can get.
Okay. Great. Next on our list was Tony Layden.
Hi, this is actually in some sense a follow-up to Carol's point, and I wanted to sort of force us as a group, not just this panel, to think about the relation and distinction between civic education and civic reasoning. So I think Carol was pointing out that we need to broaden, as it were, the where of this. Where do we get training in civic reasoning? But I'd also suggest that maybe the focus on civic reasoning narrows the what. That is, not everything that we think should go into civic education is about making people better civic reasoners. Not every form of agency involves reasoning. Some forms of agency are communicative, and I would want to include them in reasoning, but I think it's helpful not to think that all forms of good civic behavior are forms of civic reasoning. And so I just want to, we may want to clarify whether we want to be talking about civic education or when we want to be talking about civic reasoning, and then the panel might want to think about, is there a history of conceptions of civic reasoning that either runs in parallel or is different than the history of civic education writ large?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick response to that. I think that's actually been a puzzle for me from a historical perspective, because civic reasoning, to me, a focus on that suggests that it could be decontextualized. To me, civic reasoning must access some kind of historical understanding. And so I am somewhat reluctant, actually, to give up civic education as a focus, because I feel like that does potentially include some kind of knowledge and understanding. I guess I'm a little wary of a conception of civic reasoning that might suggest that we just need to know a way of talking. We don't need to actually know anything. So I'll just put that out there as my perspective, but so we might have to be different.
Could I just quickly, Nancy, saying that is what you're saying is what the whole panel is about. There's a whole paper on disciplines as well as the multidimensional.
Lost you.
Okay, and then we're really down to 1 minute each for who's left. Unfortunately, we apologize that we're running out of time. But I have Sarah Stitzline, Andrew Hartman, and Leo Casey, who will have the final word.
So I'm just keeping mine really short. I'm looking at, in your paper, the bottom of page 10, it's line 166. You say history is a category of civic reasoning. I'm not going to ask you to explain that here given the short time, but when you go back to revising the paper, that's something I'd like to hear more about what you mean by that. What does it mean to be a category of civic reasoning? This is that philosopher side of me trying to push how we're defining civic reasoning. So I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep, I'm circling that line.
Great. Andrew?
Yes. So it was a pleasure to be on the panel. I'd say more thanks, but we're running short on time. So I was really glad in her comments that Christina raised the issue of class. It's something I've been thinking about. And so I will just leave this for Zoe and Nancy, and maybe I'll extend my comments over email. But the question might be how to build the problem of class into a civic education problem. So as historians, I think, well, at least for me, it's knee-jerk to think about the current context as different from past contexts. So now most people don't necessarily have the language to allow them to articulate the ways in which labor rights relate to civic life. But of course, this has not always been the case. There have been times of high rates of unionization in the middle of the 20th century. This was not a problem. So many people had, at that point, a conceptualization of industrial democracy. That is, that people must have autonomy or power at their place of work in order for it to be a true democracy, or some semblance of democracy for working people. And so this might also allow us to sort of think further about the problematic aspects of the Cold War era of civic education or teaching for tolerance, because it rarely included tolerance for this conception of industrial democracy, because at the time it was too closely associated with socialism. And so it also represented, even as it represented sort of an expansion of thinking about race and ethnicity, it was a narrowing of thinking about how labor rights relate to, I guess, civic education. Thanks.
Yeah, that's good. I think even the nativism of the 1910s was very anti-labor.
Okay, and then finally, Leo Casey to close us out.
So it seems to me that the lens for all of the studies in this paper is basically a systems lens. It's looking at education as a system. And whereas that provides some insights, it misses some really important things. For example, any kind of meaningful discussion of civic education should be looking at Septima Clark's citizenship schools that were part of the civil rights movement. It should be looking at labor unions as education, civics education, education into citizenship. And indeed, even in a sort of contemporary situation, most of the interesting civics programs are not like a district program, they're independent programs. And the one last thing I want to say about that is that when you have a systems lens, you tend to think of things in terms of mandates. What can be done system-wide? What can the top direct the bottom to do? Well, I would suggest that the major problem in citizenship education is building the capacity in teachers to do the sort of pedagogy that actually builds agency in their students, and that can't be mandated.
Yeah, I think the paper actually does try to take up more examples of that kind of agency and teaching for agency, and we do actually have a significant Charleston-centered example from not Septima Clark's school exactly, but part of that movement. But yeah, so I think maybe in recommendations we tended towards more of systems examples, but I don't think that, yeah, I think we're looking at a broader, we're not just looking at systems.
Great, well, I think this is a good time to take